My biggest challenge here, I think, probably is trying to take the complexity of the U.S. China economic relationship, particularly and including the policymaking side of it, and keep it within the 20 minutes that I have. But I'll do my best. I'll speak a lot more quickly, actually, than Alan Romberg did, probably to try to fit things in. Let me say that I am a hugely big, after 25 years in the Foreign Service, I'm a big believer in the importance of individuals in the policymaking process. Often, whether an issue gets dealt with, how it gets dealt with, is a function of the individuals. That said, as we have seen, I think, in certain parts of the world recently, the actions, the outcomes are bounded by reality. I mean, there are limitations on what can be accomplished based on the sort of the real world constraints, and that's certainly true with regard to U.S. China economic relations. So therefore, I thought I would start with what I sort of think of as my framework, the way I think about sort of the boundaries of what is possible or what is the sort of reality of the terrain in U.S. China economic relations. In my view, there are three things to keep in mind when we think about policy making, regardless of who's in the Congress, who controls the Congress, or who's in the White House. Number one, on balance, the economic relationship is a net positive for the United States and for China as well. But our bilateral relationship, on balance, is a net positive. This is not to say there are not individual companies, workers. Think about the textile workers in North Carolina. It's not to say there are not individuals who are, in a sense, the losers who suffer in the system, but on balance, it is a net positive. And this is important. When you're thinking about policy, and I think there are increasingly a large number of policymakers in Washington who understand it's a net positive, how you think about how you want to proceed is tempered, I think, by the fact that we are operating in a net positive relationship. It's important, though, to get past the cliches. The bilateral trade numbers are not a basketball score. Like the Chinese are not winning by 250 billion points. They are not hollowing out U.S. manufacturing. There are a lot of serious issues, and we can talk about them, and I've spent particularly the last several years negotiating and pushing my Chinese counterparts on that. But overall, as I say, I think we have a net positive in the relationship. Number two, U.S. options to address many of the largest issues that we have with China in the economic area are very limited. And I say they're limited for three reasons. Number one, our economies are highly interconnected. A lot of people sit and talk about the great leverage that we have because we buy so much from China. The fact is, because our economies are interconnected, there is very little we can do to pressure China or punish China in the economic area, which does not also create significant pain here in the U.S. And again, in the interest of time, won't go into a lot of detail. Happy to get further into that. One interesting, study came out, I think, 3 to 4 months ago. University of Chicago made the point that not only have Americans benefited from low-cost imports from China in terms of lowering cost of living, but in fact, particularly Americans with lower incomes have gained the greatest benefit from inexpensive imports from China. So for a lot of reasons, the interconnectedness of our relationship, I think, imposes constraints. Second, and this is kind of the flip side of that, there are large and increasingly obvious positives in our economic relationship with China. Was it in the film, I guess, or maybe it was Tom in the morning had mentioned, 2001 to 2005, U.S. exports to China have grown at 5 times the rate they grew to the rest of the world. Today, China is our largest export market outside of our 2 NAFTA partners, and they've achieved that status starting from, I think it was number 11 as an export market 7 years ago or something. More and more jobs in the United States are dependent on exports from China. That is in addition to the very healthy profits that most U.S. companies are earning on the ground in China, profits that can then come back for support pensions for workers in the United States or additional R&D. Think about a company like General Motors, for whom one of the few bright spots, in fact, is their China operations. So there are big positives, and as I say, as you're thinking as a policymaker, people hesitate to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. If you're thinking about we're going to get tough with China on intellectual property rights or whatever it is, one needs to think about what we lose in that kind of a trade-off. Number three, China and the United States are both members of the World Trade Organization. Thankfully, to date, the U.S. Congress, including, I would say, both Republicans and Democrat leaders on trade issues, have understood that it is important that we not wreck the world trading system by taking actions that would be blatantly inconsistent with the WTO. I'm sure there are a lot of them would be happy to tiptoe up to the edge. But the fact is, for all of the screaming and yelling that you see coming out of the Congress, I don't think we can identify one really significant negative piece of trade legislation with regard to China over the last 4 years, 6 years or so. So there's a lot of noise, but there is, I think, a recognition that the WTO rules do bound our behavior. For example, unilaterally imposing 27.5% tariffs on imports from China because we happen to think the exchange rate isn't what it should be, would be a WTO violation. And that legislation, in fact, never, well, after the initial, there may have been a period where it was close to passing initially, but it didn't and has faded away, really. So, as I say, the first thing is, on balance, the relationship is a net positive. Second, our options to get progress on the really big, complicated issues are difficult. And then the third point is, we just cannot expect breakthroughs on the large, complicated issues in any kind of short-term framework. On issues like intellectual property rights, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, food safety, the exchange rate of the renminbi, the trade deficit, etc., there are no magic bullets. And as was pointed out in the article, you know, the folks who sit outside during a presidential campaign always whack the guys in power, whatever administration it is, for not being smart enough or tough enough. But indeed, when they get into power, they understand, they learn there are no magic bullets. And there are no magic bullets for two reasons. Number one, because, as I said, our options are limited. The magic leverage to force China to do these things doesn't really exist. Number two, and I think perhaps more significantly, on the big, complicated issues, the Chinese government itself can't solve these problems, can't deliver on solving these problems. Many of them are politically complex. There's a lot of political jockeying, interest groups in China pushing in different directions. I always like to use the analogy of the immigration policy in the U.S. Everybody knows we've got to fix it, but tremendously difficult to do. Furthermore, a lot of these issues get to questions of political stability in China. And particularly today, by the way, when we have a leadership structure in China which has moved away from the single, all-powerful sort of Mao Zedong autocrat to a situation in which the senior party leaders have to operate by consensus. They have to think about what major provincial leaders are thinking, etc. Very difficult to move on many of these issues. Furthermore, it's difficult for the Chinese to move on these issues because the Chinese government has an enormously difficult time implementing any of its laws and regulations. Think about food safety within China. Think about mine safety within China. Think about traffic regulations for those of you who travel to China. There is a structural and a systemic issue here, a problem of enforcement of laws and regulations. And finally, the Chinese government has a tough time on getting this done because of a lack of capacity. How many police are there in China who are trained in the nuances of investigating theft of intellectual property rights. How many judges who understand how you deal with such a case? And across the board, whether it's food inspectors, whatever it is, there are enormous needs in China in terms of building the capacity to run the very sophisticated kind of regulatory system that's required. Now, having said this, please, I don't want people to walk out here and say, well, Levine says, sort of whatever the Chinese want to do is okay with us, and there's nothing we can do about that. That is not what I'm saying. I happen to believe that over time, we can make progress on these big issues. In fact, I would argue, and I'd be happy in the discussion, the Q&A period, I would argue we have made progress in virtually every one of these areas, and we continue to make progress. However, we are setting ourselves up for frustration and political failure if we allow our expectations to get ahead of the reality. Secondly, I would say there are many smaller issues which are very important to individual U.S. companies or individual U.S. industries, which we can address, and many we have addressed. And again, I'd be happy to get into that. One, going back 4 or 5 years, was a unique encryption standard that the Chinese government wanted to impose for Wi-Fi networks. Would have knocked our laptop manufacturers, our chip makers out of the market in China. We escalated that to very high levels. Chinese government backed off. That regulation is not enforced in China today. So there are smaller issues that we can be successful on, and we need to be as aggressive as we can on that. Let me say that in all of this that I've just described, there is, I think, an important corollary. I don't know really if it's a corollary, but I like the word corollary. And that is, I will not spell it. And that is to say that while we spend a lot of time, particularly when you're in the trade policy business, you spend a lot of time complaining about Chinese government policies and so on. The fact of the matter is, of course, there is an enormous amount that we can do at home to get our own house in order if we are genuinely concerned about our competitiveness relative to the Chinese economy over the coming 10, 15, 20, 30 years. This, of course, gets into problems that are tough for us, right? Education policy, how do you lift the burden of health care costs off of small business in the U.S.? What about our visa problems? What about ensuring that our FDA and our Consumer Product Safety Commission have the resources that they need to inspect more effectively products coming into the U.S.? So there's a lot that we need to do. Always easier to scapegoat the other guy, and indeed, a lot of issues that China needs to tackle. We have a lot of legitimate gripes, but also a lot we need to do at home. I won't go through a laundry list of issues. I've already mentioned some of them. I will flag one, though, that I find particularly worrisome with regard to China today, and again, we can talk about it more in the discussion period. That is the issue of rising economic nationalism in China. We are seeing sort of a backlash against China's opening that has occurred since WTO as U.S. companies have gained market share. They've purchased famous Chinese companies, and we are seeing a backlash. And I think China needs to make a choice whether it's going to continue down the road of using government policies to protect domestic industries for this reason, or whether it's going to move much more to a model of competition as the way to allow Chinese companies to strengthen themselves. But that's one particular issue that I think is something for us to watch. One of the questions posed was sort of who are the players in all of this? And on the economic policy side, we could spend a whole day or two just on that subject. I think within the executive branch in Washington, the players are virtually every agency, including the domestic agencies in the U.S. who are engaged in exchanges and seminars and training with Chinese counterparts. Fundamentally, though, I would say in recent years, our trade policy has been driven by the Commerce Department, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and since Hank Paulson's arrival at the Treasury Department, the Treasury Department. It was not a big player before, but Hank Paulson's arrival obviously has changed the picture. Interestingly, for the folks who are into sort of comparative government here, in the Clinton administration, I would have said the lineup was very different. In the Clinton administration, it would have been the National Security Council staff as the main driver to China policy, economic policy, among others, with support from the State Department. The others, in some ways, less significant. This National Security Council staff and this administration has decided very early on that it was not going to play a policy leadership role in the bureaucracy. I think it's a mistake. I think there's a loss there of coordination, but that's the way it is. Subsequently, of course, as everyone knows, Secretary Paulson arrived, became the czar of China economic policy. Tom had mentioned the Strategic Economic Dialogue, which I think is a tremendously positive effort. I would probably carp and offer a few criticisms of how things could be done slightly differently, and again, happy to get into that in the discussion period, but clearly that kind of dialogue is important and needs to be continued. A key question for the next administration is, how do you structure your senior level dialogue with the Chinese? And again, happy to give you my views, but I don't want to eat up my 20 minutes here. Legislative branch, let me just say, lots of people involved, lots of players. As I said, though, in my view, their actions, when you get down to it and you look at their actions, they are bounded by the realities of the economic relationship. Business community, a huge big player in our bilateral relations, though I would note that it's not one business community. You have the companies, many of them the large companies, multinationals, that benefit very clearly from our economic relationship with China. They lobby, they go to the media. On the other hand, you have a large vocal number of companies who have felt they are harmed by U.S.-China relations. Think of the textile industry, think of the steel industry, and so forth. They are also out there lobbying, going to the media, funding studies of the damage of our relations. So a lot of complexity in that picture. In addition, we have non-governmental organizations who are active, and we get into the question of human rights groups, environmental groups. Frankly, I think their impact is limited, and in my view, this is a sign that we have reached some maturity in our in our overall relations with China. In other words, trade issues get dealt with as trade issues, human rights issues get dealt with as human rights issues, military strategic issues get dealt with in their area. We don't sit with the Chinese and say, gosh, if you release a dissident, we won't bring this case to the WTO. We deal in each area largely, I think, on its own merits, and in my view, that's the way sort of mature powers deal with each other rather than trying to link everything. Finally, and I guess I'm just about up against the limit, looking ahead, what is possible in the current context? In my view, with the current turmoil in the financial markets, I mean, it is obvious it's always easier to push for more openness in any country when times are good. So I think that with the turmoil and uncertainty, China is going to be a little bit more reluctant to move toward more opening, more competition-based mechanisms. Having said that, I think the financial crisis to date has not had a big impact on U.S.-China economic relations. If anything, I would say on the policy side, it's been a modest plus because, and Eugene Huang from Treasury can speak to this later, but I think there's been good cooperation between the U.S. and Chinese governments. So I think there's a modest plus. The question is, I will finish up by saying, if the financial crisis spills over into the so-called real economy and we see high unemployment in the United States and a lot of anger by people over their economic situation, at that point, the pressures for protectionism certainly will rise, and the same will happen in China as well. Let's hope that doesn't happen. The Dow is up over, 900 points today. So on that positive note, thank you very much.